Welcome to our channel, where every Reddit story takes you from one surprise to the next. Have you ever wondered what would happen if the people you love most were the ones who pushed you into a dead end? Raquel, a girl wrongly accused, died tragically in a small basement and returned as a spirit, forcing her family to face horrifying truths. But is the truth enough to awaken the conscience of those who caused the tragedy? Or is this just the beginning of an endless cycle of revenge? Stay tuned and find the answer. My stepsister set me up in such an elaborate way that even I was surprised by her ability to manipulate others. With just a few tears and perfectly timed displays of weakness, she managed to convince my three brothers, who had always been my refuge, to lock me in the basement of our house. It was a tiny, dark space without windows or proper ventilation. Everything was secured with chains as if I were some kind of monster they feared. I pounded on the door with all the strength I had, crying and shouting, but my voice echoed back at me, lost in the cold, unfeeling walls. My pleas were met with the indifference of my brothers. Jaime, my eldest brother, the man I admired most, didn't even look at me with a shred of compassion. His face, always calm and calculated as befits a business tycoon, was now filled with a mix of disappointment and anger. Before leaving, he threw the harshest words I'd ever heard at me. "It's bad enough that you're always harassing Liliana, but cooking seafood for her when you know she's allergic? Were you trying to kill her? Stay here and think about what you've done." Then, he slammed the door shut, the sound hitting my chest like a hammer blow. Guillermo, my second brother, with his rising fame as a musical star, didn't even try to soften the situation. He looked at me with a disdain I had never seen before. "Someone as cruel as you doesn't deserve our compassion. You're always making excuses and playing the victim. It's better for you to stay here and face the consequences of your actions." Enrique, the youngest, a painter whose sensitivity I always believed would make him side with me, simply nodded. His gaze, full of reproach, was more painful than any words. "Staying here will be a lesson for you, Raquel. Maybe you'll learn something." With that, they left, carrying Liliana in their arms, trembling and weak, as they rushed to the hospital. As the hours passed, the air in the basement grew heavier. Every breath became a struggle that brought tears of despair. I remembered their looks, their words, their judgments, delivered without even listening to me. Slowly, desperation gave way to exhaustion. I pounded on the door again and again, scratching at the wood until my nails bled, but no one came. 3 days later, when my brothers returned from the hospital with Liliana recovering, they finally remembered that I was still locked up. But it was too late. By the time they opened the door, they found my lifeless body. The stale air had consumed every last bit of hope. My hands bore the marks of my desperate struggle, my face frozen in the terror of my final moments. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer part of this world. My spirit floated through the mansion I once called home. I watched my brothers from a distance, unnoticed by them. Jaime spoke gently to Liliana, while Guillermo and Enrique attended to her with devotion. "Thank goodness we made it to the hospital on time. You're recovering so quickly," said Jaime, his warmth cutting through me like a knife. Enrique added with evident concern, "The doctor said you're still weak. You need to eat well." Liliana, ever the perfect actress, accepted with a shy smile. At that moment, one of the maids, Maria, timidly tried to mention my absence. "Young masters, Miss Raquel hasn't made any noise in the basement for 3 days. Jaime cut her off with a scoff. "Today is a happy day. Liliana is back. Don't ruin it by talking about that troublemaker." The other two brothers nodded, backing his decision without question. "That wretched girl knew exactly what she was doing," Guillermo spat. "She planned it all to hurt Liliana." "It's just another example of how selfish she's always been," added Enrique. From my spectral form, I heard every word. Bitterness consumed me. No one thought to investigate what had really happened. No one considered that I might be innocent. I remembered how, after our parents died, my brothers did everything they could to make me happy. They even adopted Liliana, so I'd have someone my age to play with. But Liliana, with her feigned sweetness and calculated manipulations, had shattered those bonds with an ease that left me stunned. The pain of their betrayal was unbearable, but the worst part was realizing that I had never been more than a secondary option in their hearts. Liliana, the intruder, had completely taken my place. However, something inside me told me that not everything was lost. The truth has a curious way of coming to light, and I was determined to do whatever it took to ensure the truth about Liliana and her scheme was revealed. At first, when Liliana arrived at the house, I felt genuine joy. I thought that, finally, I would have someone my age to share my days with. But that feeling didn't last long. It was almost imperceptible at first, a word here, a gesture there. Every time we were in front of my brothers, Liliana seemed to find a way to make me look bad. If I spilled something at the table, she would immediately say, "Raquel, please be more careful," in such a soft tone that, to them, it sounded like concern. But I knew it was pure manipulation. If I forgot something, she would rush to remind me with that innocent smile that made them look at me with disapproval. Gradually, our conversations stopped being cheerful and began to fill with tension. And the worst part was that my brothers never noticed what was really happening. To them, Liliana was the perfect victim, the fragile and sweet orphan who only wanted to fit in. I, on the other hand, became the problematic sister, the one who didn't know how to appreciate the blessing of having her around. Over time, the bond between us completely broke. In hindsight, I don't even know if it ever truly existed. Liliana didn't need to do much to win over my brothers. A few well-timed tears and a couple of stories about her difficult childhood were enough for them to protect her as if she were made of glass. And apparently, I was the villain who needed to learn not to break it. That's why, when the allergic reaction happened, they didn't even hesitate to believe it was my fault. There were no questions, no attempts to hear my side of the story. Guillermo, with that superior look he always saved for his lessons, locked the chains around the door of the basement, while Enrique, the quiet but decisive one, piled heavy objects in front of it to block any possible escape. I was left alone in that small, grim space. At first, I thought someone would regret it, that they would come back to at least listen to me. But they didn't. I knocked on the door again and again, screaming with all my strength, begging them to let me out. "This is a misunderstanding," I said, though I knew they wouldn't listen. They just stared at me coldly from the other side. "What are you complaining about? This is your fault," Guillermo said with that lecturing voice of his. "If it weren't for you, Liliana wouldn't have suffered such a severe allergic reaction. We've spoiled you too much. That's why you keep mistreating her. Stay there and reflect on what you've done." As I listened to those words, I felt something inside me break. It wasn't just the fear of being locked up. It was the realization that the people I loved most in this world had abandoned me without hesitation. From my corner, I could imagine Liliana, with that fake smile she always saved for my brothers, tugging on Jamie's sleeve with her timid, calculated tone. "Brother, don't be mad anymore. It's my fault for being so weak and having allergies. I'm sure Raquel didn't do it on purpose. Please don't blame her too much." And as always, Jaime allowed himself to be convinced. His expression darkened further, but not with doubt, with anger directed solely at me. "That girl, we've spoiled her too much, and that's why she's become so arrogant." Guillermo and Enrique didn't hold back either. Guillermo's eyes glowed with restrained fury as he said, "The older she gets, the more selfish she becomes. If it weren't for her, Liliana wouldn't be going through all of this." And Liliana, the great actress, showed her arms and legs where faint traces of the rash were still visible. Enrique, with his apparent genuine concern, gently ran his hand over the marks and asked softly, "Does it still hurt, Liliana?" She, as always, lowered her gaze and pretended to cry. "It doesn't hurt, really. I'm fine." Guillermo's anger erupted. "If we had gotten to the hospital any later, this could have cost you your life, and after all these days, Raquel hasn't sent a single message, not even an attempt to apologize." Jaime, filled with rage, declared, "Go get that wretched girl. I want her to apologize right here and show me if she has any ounce of remorse." But they didn't know it was already too late. While they defended Liliana and condemned my supposed mistakes, I was struggling for every breath in that basement, knowing they would never let me out. I can't help but think that deep down, I always knew it would end this way. Liliana never wanted to be my sister. She wanted my place. And apparently my brothers were more than willing to give it to her. When they finally found my body, there was nothing left to do. But for me, that was only the beginning of a truth I was determined to reveal. A truth that would finally make my brothers see Liliana for who she truly was.
"Well, you are mistaken. I want to see her on her knees, begging for forgiveness."
I had no choice but to follow my three brothers as they marched resolutely toward the basement door. A deep sadness weighed on me, a suffocating heaviness clinging to my chest. They, filled with anger and determination, seemed incapable of suspecting that the truth was about to strike them like a punch in the face. "Raquel Hernandez!" they shouted in unison, their voices echoing terrifyingly through the halls.
"Sir."
Do you think staying silent in there will stop you from paying for what you've done? Not a single sound came from inside. The air was thick with tension, and each second of silence only fueled their fury. Guillermo, who usually had a cold but controlled demeanor, clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Raquel Hernandez, come out immediately and apologize to Liliana. Don't think turning off your phone and hiding will make us forget what you've done, he growled, his dark eyes sparking with a mix of contempt and frustration. Enrique stepped forward, his voice charged with restrained anger.
Do you really think disappearing will manipulate us? Open the door already!
But the silence continued to be the only response. Jamie, always the most pragmatic and composed of the three, turned to the servants who stood nearby, their faces filled with fear. Why do you look so frightened? Tell me the truth. Did she bribe you to let her escape?
A trembling maid quickly shook her head. Guillermo, however, muttered suspiciously. With how despicable she is, she probably couldn't take the confinement and beg them to unlock the door.
Don't be ridiculous, Enrique retorted with a sigh full of disappointment. What's certain is that she doesn't have the courage to face what she's done. Is this really the sister we thought we knew? Do you think we don't have anyone else to care about?
Finally, one of the servants, an older woman with a face lined with wrinkles that seemed to tell 1,000 stories, mustered the courage to speak in a trembling voice.
Young master, we never let her out without your permission. Miss Raquel has been locked in there for 3 full days. Her words fell like a cold bucket of water. Enrique stared at the closed door with a mix of disbelief and what seemed to be a flicker of doubt. He approached and turned the knob several times, then tugged forcefully at the chain securing the entrance. Raquel Hernandez, stop pretending. I've already removed all the locks. Are you still holding the door from the inside? From my spectral form, I watched the scene with bitter irony. I knew there was no way they could uncover the truth on their own. I remembered my final moments when I pounded on that damn door with all my strength, driven by the desperation of someone who feels death breathing down their neck. But the air had grown thinner and thinner. Every attempt to open even a crack in that sturdy wood had been futile. My life had ended there, suffocated, forgotten in that bleak little room. Jamie, who was growing increasingly impatient, kicked the door with a force that made the frame tremble. After several blows, it creaked open slightly, releasing a repugnant stench. It smells like something decomposing, the older maid murmured, covering her nose with her apron. The 3 brothers exchanged uneasy but disbelieving glances. Something decomposing? Bah! She must have escaped and left a dead animal behind to trick us, Guillermo scoffed with a grimace of disgust.
Raquel Hernandez, do you think we'll fall for such a pathetic ruse? Added Enrique, stepping forward.
But the foul smell could no longer be ignored. Finally, the 3 of them joined forces, kicking the door together, their blows echoing like thunder through the hallway. With a final crash, the door gave way completely. The stench that emerged was overwhelming, but what struck them even harder was not the smell, but what they found on the other side. There, at the far end of that dark and narrow basement, lay my body. My brothers froze, their expressions shifting rapidly from anger to disbelief and finally to absolute horror. Jaime was the first to react, dropping to his knees in front of my lifeless body.
No! No! His voice was barely a strangled whisper, followed by a heart-wrenching scream that echoed through the mansion. Guillermo, always the most arrogant, was now completely pale, as if all the blood had drained from his face. Enrique, unable to hold himself together, vomited in a corner, shaking from head to toe.
My body, now cold and rigid, bore the marks of my final struggle. My nails were broken and bloody from scratching at the door, and my face, contorted into a mask of terror and desperation, silently screamed the truth of my death.
Behind them, Liliana watched with a perfectly calculated expression of horror. But I, in my incorporeal state, could see the glint of satisfaction hidden deep in her eyes.
Something strange began to happen. The mansion's lights flickered, and a chilling wind swept through the halls despite all the windows being shut. One of the older servants, who had remained silent until then, whispered in a low, trembling voice, "Miss Liliana."
But her sentence was cut short by the sound of the fallen chains and the sobs that filled the air. The truth was beginning to surface, and I had no intention of resting until everyone faced the consequences of their actions.
Maria, with her eyes fixed on Liliana and a mixture of horror and understanding on her face, broke the silence. The seasoning jar that Miss Raquel was given, I saw her add something strange to it that morning. Liliana's face changed for an instant, a fraction of a second during which her mask of innocence slipped, revealing a shadow of panic. However, she recomposed herself almost immediately, as if nothing had happened. Jaime, still kneeling next to my lifeless body, slowly lifted his head, his expression colder than I had ever seen in life. His voice was hoarse, strained, as if every word required great effort. "What did you say, Maria?" As I watched the scene unfold in my spectral state, something strange began to happen. A different energy took over me. The lights flickered again, and for the first time since my death, I felt I could do more than just watch. Objects on the shelves trembled slightly, and an intense cold filled the room. My revenge was just beginning, and Liliana had no idea what was coming. The funeral was undoubtedly a spectacle of hypocrisy that churned my stomach. Liliana, dressed in an elegant black dress, theatrically sobbed while leaning on Jaime's arm. Her crocodile tears managed to fool everyone, except Maria. The elderly maid watched her from the last rows of the church with a mixture of fear and disdain that was almost tangible. At the wake, I discovered that my new condition allowed me to perform unsettling things. When Liliana approached my coffin with a white rose, a symbol of purity that was as ironic as it was inappropriate, something extraordinary happened. All the flowers in the arrangement instantly wilted, leaving dried petals and drooping stems. Murmurs filled the room as Liliana visibly paled. "It's as if Raquel is trying to tell us something," Guillermo whispered, his voice trembling. Enrique, however, remained silent. Since finding my body, he had not spoken a word. He simply stared at my coffin, his hands clutching a sketchbook filled with portraits of me he had drawn over the years. However, the most revealing moment occurred during the reading of my will. As expected, my brothers inherited most of my assets. But there was an unexpected twist. My personal diary was to be read publicly. "If you are reading this," the notary began, "it means that something has happened to me. And if that something was caused by a seafood accident, I want the seasoning jar Liliana gave me that day to be investigated." Liliana, visibly affected, barely managed to maintain her mask of sorrow. But Maria, present at my insistence in the will, intervened with compelling evidence. "I have something to show," she declared, pulling a small glass jar from her apron. "This is the original jar. Miss Liliana filled it with something else that morning. I saw it with my own eyes." The silence that followed was sepulchral. Jaime, with trembling hands, took the jar and examined it closely. At the bottom were remnants of a white powder that was clearly not normal seasoning. This needs to be analyzed," he murmured, his voice breaking for the first time since my death. Liliana attempted to interject, but at that moment something strange happened. When she opened her mouth to speak, no sound came out. Real panic reflected in her eyes as she clutched her throat, and I, floating near the ceiling, couldn't help but feel a bitter satisfaction as I saw my plan begin to unfold. The diary was not my only card. On my desk, I had left a sealed envelope containing copies of the conversations Liliana had on her phone. Weeks before my death, she had carelessly left her phone unlocked, and my distrust led me to back up everything I needed. The messages revealed far more than she could have imagined. Since my death, the mansion had grown colder. The servants swore they heard cries and footsteps at night, but that was nothing compared to what was yet to come. Because if there's anything worse than death, it's the guilt that slowly eats away at the soul, and I would make sure Liliana felt every second of that torment. The analysis of the jar arrived quickly. The results were devastating. It contained traces of a highly concentrated allergen mixed with substances that intensified the symptoms. Jaime, holding the report in his hands, seemed unable to contain his fury. Guillermo and Enrique, upon hearing the news, were petrified. The truth was beginning to unravel, and Liliana was caught in her own web. The revenge I had planned in life was simple, but in my spectral state, I had infinite resources. My actions were not aimed at physical violence, but at dismantling Liliana's facade piece by piece, allowing the weight of her lies and betrayals to crush her. Because the truth, more than any punishment, was the most lethal weapon I could wield against her. The report was clear. The substances found in the jar contained traces of a potent concentrated allergen mixed with chemicals that exacerbated the symptoms of a severe allergic reaction. Jaime, the eldest of my brothers, held the document in his hands, his knuckles white from the tension. His gaze shifted between the paper and Liliana, who sat across from him in the office. Her performance as an innocent girl was still impeccable, though her face was starting to lose color. "There must be a mistake," she murmured, her voice trembling but firm enough to attempt to sound convincing. "I would never—" "Enough!" Jaime shouted, his voice thundering through the room like a clap of lightning, making the windows tremble. He slammed the report onto the table with a sharp thud and looked directly into her eyes. Do you think I'm stupid? Are the messages on your phone also a mistake? Ah, yes, the messages. I watched as the color drained completely from Liliana's face. Her lips started trembling as Jaime unlocked his phone and began reading aloud. The plan is going perfectly, Jaime read, raising his eyes, now filled with restrained anger. That fool Raquel trusts me so much she won't even taste the seasoning before using it. Her brothers are so easy to manipulate. Soon I'll have everything she owns. Guillermo entered the office at that moment, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief as Jaime showed him the screen. He read silently but couldn't stop his voice from escaping when he reached the end. This is monstrous! Guillermo's eyes locked onto Liliana, who was now visibly trembling. Her legs failed to support her, and she collapsed into the chair, clumsily leaning on the desk for support. I can explain, she stammered, but the words didn't complete her defense. Explain what? Enrique's voice, which had remained silent in the shadows, finally emerged. It was cold, almost a whisper, but carried an unmistakable fury. He stepped forward, arms crossed. Explain how you killed our sister, how you manipulated us for years. The lights in the office began flickering, and a cold wind swept through the room, scattering the papers on the desk and making the curtains sway. From my incorporeal form, I couldn't help but smile bitterly. I focused all my energy, and the messages from Liliana's phone began projecting onto the walls as though they were scenes from a horror movie. Message after message, the truth unfolded. This wasn't the first time Liliana had done something like this. There were 3 previous families, 3 heirs accidentally killed, 3 fortunes that she and her biological mother, Carmen Vasquez, had destroyed. Now my family had become their 4th victim. Jaime, visibly affected, took a deep breath before speaking, each word laced with ice. The police are on their way, he said, turning toward Liliana, who clung desperately to the edge of the desk. And not just for Raquel's death, we've contacted the other families. Liliana's world began to collapse. Her carefully constructed mask of innocence started to crack. In a final attempt to escape, she stood and ran toward the door, but it slammed shut in front of her. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was me. Who could say? Maria, the eldest servant in the house, appeared in the doorway holding a yellowed envelope in her hands. Her voice trembled, but there was an unusual firmness in her tone. Miss Raquel had begun the process to legally transfer part of her inheritance to you, Miss Liliana. She handed the envelope to Jaime, who opened it and silently read its contents. The final blow came with this revelation. Liliana didn't cry out of guilt or fear of the police. What broke her was the weight of my genuine love, a love she had betrayed in the most vile way. The police sirens shattered the silence of the night as an inexplicable chill filled the room. I felt a strange sense of peace knowing that my vengeance wouldn't be bloody or violent, but something far more devastating, the truth. In the days that followed, the police uncovered the entire network of scammers led by Carmen Vasquez. The orphanage, where my brothers had found Liliana, was merely the facade of a much more sinister operation. Investigators revealed how they infiltrated wealthy families to destroy them from within. My family had been just another piece in their game, but this time, the truth had come to light. And I, from my incorporeal form, watched as the world Liliana had built on lies crumbled around her. Discovering that Liliana was not just a manipulative liar, but part of a full-blown network of fraudsters gave me a bitter sense of relief. It felt like, at the very least, my death hadn't been entirely in vain. The detectives on the case dismantled every part of the scheme that she and her biological mother, Carmen Vasquez, had meticulously constructed. It turned out that the orphanage where my brothers had adopted her wasn't just any place, it was their operational base. They strategically selected girls with certain attributes, an appearance of innocence, conventional beauty, the ability to act well in social situations, and placed them into wealthy families, preparing them to destroy those families from within. When the investigators presented their findings, my brothers were devastated. Jaime, always the rational and calculating one, couldn't comprehend how they had been so blatantly deceived. That night, I saw him sitting in my room, which remained untouched, as if they were still waiting for me to return at any moment. He held a photograph of the 5 of us taken when Liliana had first joined our family. I remembered that day clearly. We were all smiling, and I thought she would be the sister I had always wanted. But that smile was a lie. Jaime murmured something I never expected to hear. Raquel tried to tell us so many times. We didn't listen. My warnings had always been dismissed as childish jealousy or simple misunderstandings. Jaime, the unyielding magnate who never shed a tear in public, now let them fall freely onto that photograph. His pain was palpable, but I couldn't feel sorry for him. After all, he was one of the people who had locked me in that basement. Guillermo, on the other hand, couldn't cope with the weight of his guilt. His burgeoning musical career came to an abrupt halt. He couldn't play a single note without hearing the sound of my desperate banging on the basement door echoing in his mind. One night, I saw him in his studio holding a crumpled sheet of paper. It was a song we had written together for my birthday. "It was for you," he murmured, as if I were there to hear him. "I never got to show it to you." Meanwhile, Enrique, the family's artist, took refuge in his painting, but his once vivid world of bright colors turned dark and tormented. His canvases were filled with disturbing images, the basement door, my bloodied hands clawing at it, my face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Each brushstroke screamed his regret. Maria, the only one who had always known the truth, spent her days in the kitchen preparing my favorite dishes. It was almost a ritual for her, as if she were trying to keep my memory alive. Once I overheard her telling one of the servants, "Miss Raquel always said that food tastes better when it's made with love." She knew something was wrong with that seasoning. She even tasted it herself to make sure it was safe. And it was true. Liliana had to use an excessive amount of the seasoning because I had tested it in small quantities, ensuring it was safe. My suspicions about her weren't unfounded. They simply refused to listen to me. The evidence against Liliana piled up quickly. Her phone contained photos of her previous victims, young, trusting heirs like me, all dead in what appeared to be accidents or suicides. To her, they were nothing more than trophies of her success. But the harshest blow came when the detectives handed Jaime a notebook found in Carmen Vasquez's house. "Mr. Hernandez, we found this in a safe. It contains detailed instructions on how Liliana was to manipulate every member of your family." Liliana had studied my brothers for months before being adopted. She knew their weaknesses, insecurities, and blind spots, and she had exploited them all. That night, as Jaime read the notebook, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, causing the curtains to flutter violently. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. One of them muttered something about sensing a presence. They were right. I was there, growing stronger, becoming more present, because my true revenge was only just beginning. Liliana thought her punishment would end with prison, but she was wrong. She would face something far worse, the weight of her own guilt, the ghosts of all her victims, and the inescapable truth of what she had done. Every night while locked in her cell, the memories would haunt her. The lights would flicker without reason, and the cold winds from the Hernandez mansion would find her even there. Because sometimes the worst punishment isn't death, but living with the consequences of your actions.